Okay, my name is Richard DeSorgher, and for the next hour plus, we're going to walk you around, hopefully give you a little flavor and taste of what Medfield Center was like and the different changes that took place. Kind of a leisurely walk we'll do. Fire away any questions at any time. We'll start here. I'm not going to give the whole spiel in the Dwight Derby house because they'll be able to do that for you inside. But basically we figure, which is about the 20th oldest house in the United States. The interior part actually is the original 1651 section that's there. We've actually come across some of the original beams that are there. It's been added on to a number of times. So it would originally face this way, probably looked very similar to the Peak House in shape. And then it was added on a lean-to in the back part where the huge fireplace is when you go inside. That part was then added on, and then in the 1700s they added on this front part that gives it its current look that it has. There's a little part in the end they called the library or the music room. Actually was a house in itself that was further down on the corner of Dale and Ferry Street that was moved up in the early 1800s and attached. So that little L you'll see as you walk by actually was a house in itself. Hughes, H-E-W-S family had owned that. Thing that's amazing with this is there's only been 5 families that have owned the house. So it started with the Dwights. They were the first, which is where the Dwight part of the name comes. The Derbys were here the longest. So that's why you get the Derby part of the name. So it went from the Dwights to the Townsends. We're going to be talking about Reverend Townsend shortly. The Derbys, then the Bakers. The Bakers were here in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and then they sold it to the Harrises, who eventually moved and sold it to the town. And the town in 1996 ended up buying it because the developer was going to buy this house and the Dwight Derby house, tear them both down, and put a condominium complex in here. And there was a huge uproar, a lot of people in town, especially with the Historical Society and others, and they started this grassroots movement, eventually went to town meeting, and the voters at town meeting voted money to secure the house, buy it from the Harrises, and then we promised that we would not come back to ask any more money from the town again, and we formed the Dwight Derby Inc., and we've done all the fundraising and everything else, and if you've not been inside, when you're done with the tour, take a walk through. It really is a beautiful job. If you look, I'm going to cheat a little, at the very last page, you'll see what the house looked like when we were able to buy it. There was a huge tree in the front. It was all falling apart. In fact, many people said, it's not worth saving. And you can see what a beautiful job we've done with that. The only other thing I'll just mention, because we're going to talk, when we talk through the center of town, some of the churches, this is our first church that's over there, and then it was the Congregational Church. All New England would have been Congregationalists. And then in 1828, there was a split in the church, and the Unitarians moved in, and the Orthodox Congregationalists, they had a big battle, and eventually, the original ones moved out. But before they built their church, which is now the United Church of Christ, their very first service was here in the Dwight Derby house in the parlor. And Mary Derby, who was one of the Orthodox members, opened the church up, and the first service was held there. And the minister conducting the service was Reverend Edward Beecher, who was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that first church service actually took place there. So come on, let's take a walk up this way. So right here you got, if you lived in Medfield before 1976, you would probably call this Baker's Pond. In 1976, they officially named it Meeting House Pond, and that's the official name that goes with it. But it's Vine Brook that feeds into it. Now, Vine Brook was the original name of the brook. It starts up in Rocky Woods, and because of all the vines that grew over, the early settlers called it Vine Brook. And Vine Brook runs here through the center of town, runs down through Cemetery Pond, and then into the Charles River. And then what happened in 1724, William Plimpton petitioned to put a dam, because he wanted to put a fulling mill in He had a clothing place, and the fulling mill would allow him to clean the wool that went in there. And he put a 6-foot dam that was located there, and that dammed up the pond. So if you look at your second picture, it's a great picture. You can see the Dwight Derby house, and you can see the pond before there was a wall. So it was a beach. So it actually came right down into the street here. And you can see the Dwight Derby house and the pond that was there. So this has been dammed up, and it's been a pond since 1724. And it was privately owned up until 1947, when a Marion Powers, who owned that, gave it to the town. And then that included all the land you see behind there with the grass. That was all dug up. The land went down, and eventually in 1976, to improve this, the town leveled all that off and made that kind of nice green area that was there. So that's how the town actually got a hold of the property. So probably the closest thing Medfield has ever had to royalty was the Curtis and Mitchell families. And if you look at your book at number 3 and number 4, you can see the mansion that sat right here. And that was the Curtis mansion. It really looked like something out of Newport, Rhode Island. The two houses we're going to talk about, the Curtis mansion here and the Mitchell mansion, which was where the post office is. They were the closest thing Medfield had to castles. I mean, they were just beautiful buildings that were here. And the Curtises, Daniel Curtis was from Maine, came here to Medfield, and he joined with this Walter Janes. Now, Janes Avenue is that street that runs around Town Hall that's named after him. Walter Janes was one of the first ones that started the making of straw hats, which becomes the big industry in Medfield. And there was we'll talk about when we get over where the Montrose School is now, but he had a small hat shop that was over there, and Curtis joined with him, and it was called Janes and Curtis. And then Janes died, and Curtis takes over, and he becomes very wealthy. He builds the place up quite a bit. And in 1859, he builds this villa that was there, and in 1888, he remodels it into the Queen Anne style you see in photos number 2, 3, and 4 that are there, that sat here. And eventually we get into the 20s, Frank McCarthy, a local Medfield guy that is the town moderator, and Medfield he was Republican. Back then, Medfield was as all Massachusetts was in the 20s, a very Republican town. In fact, they said on the voting, and sometimes you could count the number of Democrats voting on your hand. There were that few. So Frank McCarthy runs for state rep, and he gets elected. Well, the governor at the time was Governor Paul Deaver, who was a Democrat. And Frank McCarthy gets very friendly with the Democrat Paul Deaver, and they have all kinds of parties in this house. He invites, he's a very social type person. They have a lot of parties that are here. And one of the parties that Governor Deaver was there, apparently he had a little too much to drink, and his notoriety was that he actually fell into Baker's or Meeting House Pond. So we have, if you remember, back when William Weld was governor, he made that famous dive into the Charles River. Well, we have Governor Deaver falling into Baker's Pond. So anyhow, this Frank McCarthy, because he had a friendship with the Democrat Deaver, there was another local guy by the name of Bill Nurse, who also gets elected moderator, and he's not very happy that Frank McCarthy is making these friendships with the Democrat, and so he runs against Frank McCarthy in the Republican primary, and he beats him. It's very close, but there's not good blood between the two of them. And he says to Frank McCarthy, "Someday I'm going to buy your house." And Frank McCarthy says, "Over my dead body." And he actually puts legal language in to say that in no way can Bill Nurse ever buy his house. Well, in 1953, Frank McCarthy dies of a heart attack, and his wife sells the house, and by a gentleman that she never heard of before, and buys the house. 1 month later, the guy sells the house to Bill Nurse. It's what's called a straw, where you get someone to buy the house for you. So Bill Nurse took over the house that you see there, and in 1979, he goes before the town. He's elected selectman. He goes before the town and sees if he can get the house rezoned. It's zoned residential. And very close vote, but the town goes along with him and rezones the property. Then unfortunately, a little editorializing here, but in 1986, he says he's going to sell the house to this Jackson Fabrics over in Needham. And Jackson Fabrics says they're going to tear the house down and build a replacement. And there's a huge uproar in the town. This Kathy and Jerry Lake, he's a carpenter, put an offer in about equal to what Jackson Fabrics had. It's turned down. There's a petition in the town to try to save the house. And unfortunately, he doesn't listen, and Jackson Fabrics buys the building. In 1976, they tear down what you see in 3 and 4, and they put up that building that's there to take its place. Bill Nurse then ran for re-election. Harry Petroni beat him by a huge margin, and many people were just very upset because of the loss of the house that was there. You can still see the original stone wall that goes around. That was with the house, as you can see on the photo that was there. So this is the only thing that was left of the house itself. Okay, if you look at your numbers 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, probably the most powerful person ever to be in the town of Medfield was this Colonel Edwin Vinyl Mitchell. And Mitchell marries the daughter of Daniel Curtis. And when Curtis dies, Mitchell then takes ownership of the hat factory. And the hat factory, again, was across the street where the Montrose School is, which we'll get to in a second. For their wedding gift, when Mitchell marries Ellen Curtis, Curtis builds what you see in number 5 and number 6, the mansion that is where the post office is now. So that mansion sat right next to where was another mansion that was here. This was the biggest house in town. It had 32 rooms. It had a library, huge fireplace, all mahogany that was inside, a music room. There were 11 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. And it had a huge playroom, ballroom up on the 3rd floor that could hold 800 people. Give you an idea of the size that was there. Mitchell, once he owns the hat factory, takes really total control of the town because it's the largest employer of the town. There's a box factory that's down on Park Street that makes the boxes that the hats go in. There's a wire factory down on Frary Street that makes the wire for all. So almost everything was tied into the hat factory. So if you went against Mitchell for any reason, you would basically have to move out of town. And there's a great story of the minister of the Orthodox Church. Mitchell, we're going to talk about, has the inn that's across the way there. We're going to see in a second. Medfield was a no alcohol town, and they do a raid on the Elm Tree Inn that was there because there's alcohol being served, which Mitchell owned, because the minister of the church was really pushing temperance. And Mitchell is ticked off that this place gets raided, and he tells all his workers, if any worker goes to that church, you are fired. And all of a sudden the enrollment of the Orthodox Church goes down. And we're going to talk about the old corner store. The Fitzes owned that, and Mrs. Fitz was the head of the Ladies' Society at the Orthodox Church, and he tells his workers, I see anyone in Fitz's store, you are fired. His birthday, October the 15th, was a holiday in the town. The workers had the day off. They were given money to go to the Brockton Fair to celebrate his birthday. So he had like total control over the town.
What year was this?
We're talking the late 1800s. He dies in 1917.
Wow.
So when he dies in 1917, the mansion that was over there is sold to this Clinton Frost, who opens up a hotel out of this huge mansion. Well, that's fine until Prohibition comes. And when Prohibition comes, that puts them out of business. And the place stays vacant from 1919 to 1933. And in 1933, in comes Franklin Roosevelt, and Prohibition ends, and the house or the hotel there is sold to this John Coyle, and he opens it up, a place called the Manor Inn. And they're known for their great steaks and lobsters, and the hall that seats 800 up top becomes a wedding mecca for wedding receptions and stuff. In fact, a lot of old timers here in Medfield that were here will tell you they had their weddings that were up there. In fact, one of the more famous guests that was a frequent guest here was Babe Ruth, because he had a place in Sudbury, and he used to come out, eat and drink and drink and drink at the Manor Inn. So it stayed that way right up until the 50s, and by the 1950s it began to lose some of its reputation, became more of a bar type place, and this North Street Plaza in 1961 buys the house, and their intent is to tear it down and put up a plaza, a strip mall that will be anchored by a restaurant. And in order to tear it down, they bring a tank. It wasn't a Sherman, it was a M19A Army tank with the turret taken out. And they brought it into town. The entire town was here lined up. I was just a kid. I can remember watching from the side, packed. And they watched the tank come in. And the tank started to go through the house, but they forgot they didn't turn the electricity off. So they had to wait a day, shut the electricity off, and then the next day they started smashing the tank through the house. And the tank would fall down into the basement, and a couple of minutes later you see it come back up again. And at first the people were cheering for the tank, and then as the house kind of withstood the tank, people started cheering more for the house. And it went back and forth, and eventually you can see number 8 as the house began to come down, and eventually it was demolished. And you can see in number 9 this great strip mall they put in there, which was anchored by a restaurant called the Red Vest, which was okay. It was a nice restaurant and lounge. It had a piano bar. Do you remember James, Mr. Hersey?
Yeah.
By any chance? Yeah. He played at the piano bar a lot at the Red Vest that was there. But eventually the Red Vest got sold out and the whole place was turned into a Chinese restaurant. First called Sun Island and then Golden Rice. And its reputation was not great. In fact, I think the Board of Health and the police were down there more than many people were. There were fights there. It was not a real great family place that was there. And finally, when the post office closed, the town wanted to keep the post office in the center of town. And they made a deal and actually took by eminent domain the plaza that was there, and that was torn down in 1998, and the current post office was put there. I think they were on a 50-year lease of the federal government on the town's land that was there. So we lost these 2 mansions, which really changed this whole makeup of coming into the town. It really was like what you'd see in Newport, Rhode Island. That was gone. But now look across the street. You see an empty parking lot that's there, and that was originally the home of Walter James. And I want you to look just to the left, where next to this house, there's a basketball hoop back there, as you can see back at the end of that driveway. How many of you are familiar with the Zulo Gallery up in front of town? Well, that building used to be right where that basketball hoop is. Okay, so the building itself was moved, and this Thomas L. Barney, you're going to hear a lot about him because he moved stuff all over town. He buys, it was a store, it was a clothing store that was there. Edward Chenery's property was there, and he had, that building was a clothing store that was there. And Thomas Barney buys it because he bought where where Roach Brothers is now, was another store that was there, and he bought the store that was here, moved it, and attached it to his store where Roach Brothers is now. So that actually gets moved. And there's a great story. This Waldo Fitz, when he was a kid, rode on that house, and he writes in his diary how he rode as they moved the house down into the center of town. So across the way was Walter Janes's house, and again, he's the one that had the hat factory with Curtis. And Mitchell buys it, and he turns it into, becomes the Central House, and then the Elm Tree Inn, and that's number 10, and eventually number 11. So there was a great inn that was right across the street. And with the hat factory next door, it became a place for people to stay. Eventually there were 57 rooms in what became known as the Medfield Inn that was there. And you can see the more modern picture of it in number 11. Again, Mitchell had bought that, and then when Mitchell dies, it's sold. And in 1932, and people remember, it's March 1st, 1932, it burns down. And the reason people can remember the date is the day it burnt was the same date that the Charles Lindbergh baby was kidnapped. And that was the tie. So that burns down in 1932, and it stays vacant until the 1950s. And you know where Basil's is? Well, originally that was the Francis Cafe, and they had the best Italian food that was there. And it was a local family, the Rossi family, that had it. And if you're wondering why is that restaurant tucked in that neighborhood, because before there was zoning, that was put in there. And the family had, and the Rossis lived right next door. And then when the zoning came in, you never have that today because it's in a residential area. But they decided they would move the restaurant up to this vacant lot, and they wanted to put a bowling alley in. Candlepin bowling in the bottom and the restaurant above it. And they actually began to put the foundation in until the town said, wait a minute, this is zoned residential, you can't do that. They said, okay. So they went before town meeting, and town meeting defeated it, would not let them. So it stayed vacant, that was there. And then what happened when we'll get to when the hat factory folded, Conning Medical, Seba Conning bought this whole complex that was all in here. And that's when the parking lot was put in this spot. They tore down the old foundation that was there. And I remember the foundation well because as a young kid, a little older than these guys here, with my friends, we were playing this kind of king of the castle, one on one side, and you'd jump and you'd try to wrestle and knock the kid off. Well, I got knocked off and had my arm broken. So I'll remember the old foundation that was there. So we have this beautiful inn that was located there. You have the two mansions that were here. So let's go up in the crosswalk and we'll cross and go down. Number 12 sat right here, and that was originally the parsonage for the First Parish Church. So the parsonage was across the street, and Reverend Townsend, who lived originally in the Dwight Derby house, that family, moved over here into the parsonage when he became minister of the church. Daniel Curtis, again we go Walter Janes, Curtis, and Curtis takes over. In 1876, the parsonage, you see, this becomes the hat factory, the first hat factory. And if you look in the back, you can see they've added on. They added on a couple of extensions on the back. And this is where Walter Janes and then Curtis had the hat factory. And this was the hat factory until 1876 when it burns to the ground. And when it burns to the ground, Curtis rebuilds. And this is what he rebuilds. So what's here now is the Montrose School, is the original hat factory. A lot of it's missing, but what's left is the original hat factory from 1876. And if you look at number 13, you can see in its heyday what that factory looked like. There was a third story that they took off after the hat factory closed because they didn't think the structure was sound. So it did have that third story that was there with a huge tower in the bell tower, because the bell, they would ring the bell for the workers to know when to come to work and when time was up. Which if you go up to Lowell, the Lowell Mills, if you've been up there, you'll see similar structure to that with the bell tower as well. And there's a great picture from the back, which was taken from Brook Street. Looking, you can see the extent of the hat factory. There was huge water towers there, was a huge smokestack. They had all the drying racks that were all out over this area that was there. So when Curtis had this hat factory, what they used to do, the dyes they had for all the colors, they just used to dump right here into Vine Brook. And the dyes would all run down, it was all turned blue and green, whatever the colors were, all the way down. Well, you had a couple of people, the Howards and others, that lived downstream that got their drinking water out of that, and they protested to the town. And the town told them, you got to do something to clean up. To which Curtis responded, well, we got all kinds of offers to move to other towns. We're not going to do it, because they wanted them to run a pipe from here to the Charles River to take all the dyes down. And they balked and said, we would move to another town that's offering us all kinds of tax breaks. And Medfield knew if they lost this was the huge employer of the town. And so the town backed off, and they just continued to dump the dyes into the stream that eventually goes down into the Charles River, eventually into Boston Harbor. So when Mitchell has the hat factory, and it becomes the second largest, as I said, more than 1,200 people are working in the hat factory, which is larger than the population of Medfield at the time itself. So it stays that way. When Mitchell dies in 1917, his sons take over. In a very sad story, the oldest son that takes over has a house down here on the North Street. We just put up, and hopefully we're seeing the end of this coronavirus pandemic we're in, but earlier in 1918, 1917, you had the Spanish influenza, and he's only 31 years old. He dies of the influenza. And then his brother takes over. But what kills the hat factory is the Depression. When the Great Depression hits, it closes down the hat factory, and it's sold to this Julius Tophius. He and his brother Tophius out of Boston, and they buy the hat factory, and they start to get it up running again. And by the end of the Depression, they get it going again, and it stays that way pretty good. Not as it was in its heydays before the Great Depression, but it's doing a pretty good business. It's still the #1 employer here in Medfield. #2 is the state hospital that's up there. So in the 1950s, the workers decide that they want to be unionized. And Tophius is very anti-union, and he says, no way, I will not allow a union in my shop. And so they're going to take a vote. They take a vote actually over in the church, and they vote to unionize. And he says, if you go through with this, rather than union, I'll shut the whole hat factory down. And so the next pay day that came, he pays all his workers in silver dollars. There's hundreds of these silver dollars that now get spread on all the stores all over town. He's trying to make his point. If the factory closes down, all the stores, everybody else that's dependent on, look at all these silver dollars everywhere. They go through with the vote. True to his word, in 1955, they unionize. He shuts the whole place down, ends the hat factory in Medfield. Many of the workers go to some of the other hat factories around. This stays vacant for a while. Eventually, a number of small businesses and stuff go in there until Corning, as I mentioned, took over in 1964. They stay here up until the 1980s and 90s, when they move over to Walpole and then down to Texas. And the building here comes up for sale. The town was actually offered it, and the town turns it down, and the Montrose School ended up buying it, but Medfield lost that tax revenue once the Montreux School went in there. Actually, for a little while, DeSorgher, which was a clothing store, was also located in here. Okay, across we have the First Parish Church. It's the oldest church in Medfield. It's the original. Again, we were all Congregationalists. We were Puritans, not Pilgrims. Medfield is Puritan. And in 1653, the town's founded in 1651. 2 years later, we have the first church. It originally faced the Vine Brook, so it faced the other way. It was 36 feet long, 20 feet wide, 12 feet high with a thatched roof, and it faced the brook. And then the second church, as the town grew, comes in 1705, and it's moved to face North Street, so the front door faced us this way. And the third church, which is what you see right there, was built in 1786. I was able to find the records when they built the church. It was like a barn raising. People came from all over to help the builders build the church. And in some of the records, here's what I found, what was purchased to help build that church, all the people that worked on it. There were 4 barrels of beer, 25 gallons of West India rum, 30 gallons of New England rum, 434 pounds of loaf sugar, 25 pounds of brown sugar, 465 lemons. It's actually amazing that church is standing after all that. So there was the steeple, and this is great. This is the only photo. It's the earliest photo, the first one you see of the church, of the original steeple that was on there. And then when we get to the Baptist church in 1874, the Baptists add a steeple that's taller than this one. And that gets the Unitarians all upset. They no longer have the tallest steeple in town. So what they do is they add this extension onto their steeple to make their steeple taller than the Baptist steeple. And then in the hurricane of 1938, if you look at the bottom photo, it was top heavy and the steeple comes crashing down and goes through the roof, to which the Baptists always said, see, we told you. So when that steeple came down in the hurricane of 1938, it was just capped on the top. And it stayed without a steeple until 1988 when they put that smaller steeple on the top. So you can see what it originally looked like, and then you can see without the steeple, and now of course they have the smaller steeple that's there. The parsonage is still next door. The minister no longer lives there. They use that for their religious education and things like that. So that was their parsonage. And again, yeah, I'm sorry?
Where were the records about the building? In the Mass Archives, or?
No, we actually have them in the Historical Society. The records of, there's a very close relationship of the First Parish Church and the Historical Society. And because they don't have safekeeping, once the Historical Society opened up and they have the vault and everything, a lot of their records and stuff are kept over the Historical Society.
Still belong to the church?
Many of them do, yeah, in the beginnings. But we actually have in the Historical Society for safekeeping a lot of their records. Across the street where China Sky is, North Street Market, that was the Abel House. Now when the church was built, and the church now faced Main Street this way, all this land, there were no buildings here at all. None of these buildings were here. So they did face Main Street. None of these buildings, it was all just gravel and stuff that went up. But eventually, you have a number of buildings. There were horse stables that were back here before the automobile. They had the horses, so they had the stables and stuff for the church that were back there. And there was a small cabinet making shop that was there, and a little small house back there that this Horace Hill lived in. And Horace Hill's daughter married this guy, Abel. And he tore down the carriage shop and the house, and he built his house, you see, number 19. So it was a pretty substantial structure that was right over there that you can see there. And then behind it was Medfield's first fire station. We just had one horse-drawn engine that was there, but the engine station was actually back there as well. And then Abel had a store over here. Now, if you look, this is actually a house. If you look up where the dormers are there, so if you look on number 20, what they did is they added this front part for a store in the front. You can see where the peak roof ends. So they added that. And then later when Rexall Pharmacy was in there, they added this kind of triangle section on the front of that as well. But back in the 40s and 50s, there was a barber shop up there. This guy, George Wilkins, had a barber shop and he had a huge pool table. You could play pool, there was the barber shop, and there were a number of stores. Abe was like a dry goods store that was there, sold a variety of things. And then these have always been kind of apartments and stuff. And there was Bill Alley that had the news store. Back up, actually right up into the 1960s, each town would have one person that had total monopoly of selling all the Boston newspapers in that town. And Alley had the control of all the newspapers. Bill Kelly and Lords later bought that out, and he had control. We no longer have that. So that's the two scenes you see right there. And right here where Nosh and Grog are, which I guess are moving. Yeah. They're going to Canton. So I'm not sure what will come in here now. But if you look at number 21 at that mansard-shaped roof house that's there, there was a huge boarding house that was located here. And the boarding house was for a lot of the workers that worked in the hat factory. And what they did is they wanted to move the boarding house, and the boarding house actually is located right over here on Brook Street. And they actually, in the winter time, this was all kind of swamp where that building is now. The brook runs through that. It was all flooded. That was all swamp. And when it froze in the winter, they actually jacked up this boarding house, which is huge. And it's still on Brook Street today. Numbers what? Numbers 35 and 37 Brook Street. So they moved that boarding house, and if you go down Brook Street, you'll see that today that was there. And there was a house next door. It was called the West House, which was built out of the 1790s, and that was moved onto this lot until it burnt. And then eventually it was a vacant lot, and the Larkin family that still has the liquor store over here, they bought this when the post office was looking for a new building. And they built this current building in 1958, and this became the post office. And if you look at numbers 22 and 23, you can see the bottom one is during the blizzard of '78, what the front of the post office looked like. And this becomes the post office until we moved our post office in 1998 down where it is now. Zebras and a number of other restaurants that took over for a while that were here. Okay, let's move up this way. Here's the site, originally the very first school in Medfield, which was built in 1666, and it was located right here. They built a second school in 1732, a third school in 1760, and then eventually Medfield, because you walked to school, there were no school buses. You guys take a school bus to school? No school buses back then originally, so you had to walk. So you had a north school for the kids that lived in the north end of town, you had the center school for the center town, and you had a south school for the people that lived at the south end of town. And in 1810 they built the fourth of the schools here, and they added a second story on it. And it was leased out to what was called the Medfield Academy. It was a private select school that was up there. It only lasted for a couple of years, and eventually the hall was used by the Freemasons and became a hall. And then in 1859 we needed a new school, and they built a new one down on Pleasant Street, which we'll stop to in a second. And Thomas L. Barney, the guy, took the old school and he added it to his building over there where Roach Brothers was. So that continues to grow over there. So this was always the school area of Medfield, was right here till 1859. Gene Mineo and others have done a beautiful job of restoring this kind of just vacant area into this Straw Hat Park, again, ties into the Straw Hat Factory that was there. As I told you, in 1750, there was a house that was here that was moved to the lot. And then the Fitz family, we're going to be talking a lot where Starbucks is, was called the Old Corner Store. And this Julius Fitz owned it. And when he had the store torn down, he built this small, it was called a Hodgkin house. And they were the first portable houses. They were made over in Dover. They were assembled. And this Hodgkin house was located right here. And the Fitzes lived there. And Julius Fitz, his notoriety in Medfield is that he was the oldest living Civil War veteran. He lived to be 100. And every Memorial Day they would come to the house and with the parade, and he would come out. And the other notoriety was if you shook his hand, because when he was in the Civil War, he was stationed down in Washington, D.C., and Abraham Lincoln actually came out and reviewed the troops and shook hands, and he actually got to shake hands with Abraham Lincoln, and every little kid would run up, shake hands with Julius Fitz and say, I shook the hand that shook the hand of President Lincoln. Once he died, it stayed vacant, and grass got, I remember as a little kid, probably your age, it was like a haunted house, and you kind of run by it real fast. Eventually it was torn down, this became a vacant lot, and they've done a nice job fixing it up. If you look across the street there, in the 1880s, they built the first of the kind of blocks in Medfield, and that was owned by Clinton Frost. And there was the Boston Branch grocery store that was in there. And the third floor was a hall. It was called Grace Hall. In fact, before the building of St. Edward's Church, some of the Catholic masses were actually set up into that hall. It's all apartments that are up there now. But the Larkins actually have owned that and had their liquor store once Prohibition ended. That's 88 years ago. They're the longest running single family business in the town of Medfield. Mr. and Mrs. Larkin, Albert Larkin and his wife, had a restaurant over in Route 1, and it burnt down. And right after Prohibition, they came to Medfield, and it was vacant. And there were no liquor stores in Medfield. And they applied for a liquor license, and they got it, and they opened up Larkin's Liquor Store, which has been there ever since. And
Bob Larkin's father?
Yes, and Bob Larkin and his brother Alan ran the liquor store. And then Bob Larkin later became into the real estate business, and Alan Larkin ran the liquor store, and their sons, or the original Larkin's grandkids, still run the liquor store today. And number 26, this kind of odd-shaped little stone building, comes in the early 1900s. A variety of stores have been in there. The picture you can see here is the Central Market, which is, I think, dated out of the early 1940s that was there. What they call the Old Corner Store was right here. It anchored right in the corner of North and Main Street that was here. Originally, where the Monk's Block is, the large building right there, was the original homestead of Ralph Wheelock. We're going to be talking about Ralph Wheelock, who was called the founder of Medfield. And he had his house right there where that building is located. And his son built a store right here. It was a long store that was here, and that was built in the 1790s. And in 1809, this David Fairbanks from Sharon comes in here and buys the store, and it's small, and he cuts it in half. And he moves it over here to 13 and 15 South Street, which we'll go to a second, which is still there. So that 13 and 15 South Street used to be one building located here, was cut in half, and now they're residential homes over there. And that dates from the 1790s. So you have the 1809 store that Fairbanks builds that's here, and eventually it gets added on to this. Francis Ellis buys it. He runs a store here, becomes known as the Old Corner Store. And then his brother-in-law, this guy by the name of Isaac Fiske, F-I-S-K-E, takes it over, and he runs the store that's here. And then when he sells it to this Julius Fitz, the guy I was just talking about that had the Hodgkin house that was there. And he adds on to it. He adds a third-story hall up in the top that's up there on the old corner store. And if you look right to the right, he adds a little two-story addition. You can see the town hall in the background. This is in photo 30. And this two-story addition with a couple of stores that was there as well. But in that hall up there, we talked about the Congregational Church dividing. When the Orthodox, before they built their church, they said some of the masses in the hall up in the old corner store as well that was up there. There were a lot of lectures there. During the time of the Civil War, a lot of abolitionists would come to speak that were here as well. The first library of Medfield in 1828, it was a private library. You had to pay $4 a year for a share. They had 1,000 books, but they said the books were not very good. They were all books that had been discarded from the Boston Public Library. We got them. But you could, our first library actually was in the hall up above. And in 1935, Fitz decides to tear down the old corner store. It was actually, had a one-pump gas pump that was in front as well. And when they tear down, they lived on the second floor. And when they tore it down, he moved to the Hodgkin house that was there. And the Mobile Corporations ends up buying that. And you can see in the pictures 27, 28, 29. Original Mobile was a wooden gas station that was located here. And eventually it becomes a brick building. And when Mobile moves out, Starbucks wants to buy it. They want to tear it down. But this section of Medfield is in an historic district. So they had to use the existing building that was in there. And that's what we have today as Starbucks. And if you look at the picture on the bottom, you can see the original brick Mobile, which is the same building you see here. So come on over to Town Hall. This is the site, the original home of Reverend John Wilson, first minister of Medfield. He also was in the very first class of Harvard College. There were 9 of them that graduated out of that first class, including Wilson. And if you look at the photos, Reverend Wilson's house eventually gets turned into what's called the James Clark Tavern. And you can look on number 31, you can see what was located right here. And up until it stayed a tavern right up until 1872, when this George Chenery died. He had no children, and he left the town $55,000. The town didn't have a town hall. And so all town meetings and everything were held at the First Parish Church. And so he donates money, and Medfield builds its first town hall on this site. And they divided the tavern into 3 sections and moved them to different parts of town. And they built our first town hall, which you can see in number 32. Unfortunately, 2 years later, it burns down. And we rebuild pretty much the same style. Look at number 33, you can see across the way. And it had the steep roof, a huge hall up above. In the 1950s, they actually had a movie theater that was up there. Regular movies were shown up there, was rented out. The school did, before the Dale Street School was built as a high school, there was no gymnasium in town. And they used that hall for all the basketball games. But they said the hall was not quite regulation in size. And they said actually, after getting a rebound, you could actually stand and take a shot and shoot court-wise to get it in that was there. Unfortunately, that 1874 town hall burnt down in 1923 for the second time. And to save money, they did not put the steep roof back on. So you can see the picture in number 35. So from right up until 1998, when they do the refurbishing here, the town hall had that flat roof from 1923. And then to give it the original historic look, the town put the steep roof that's on it today. And they also added, the old hall became a new third floor. That's where the school department offices are now located. And there's a great picture, if you look at photo number 36 of the trolley. The trolleys came through here to Medfield from 1899 to 1924, right through Medfield. So you could hop on the trolley in front of Town Hall and take it into Dedham. And then you could get on the, in Boston, at the end of Dedham, you could get the, what's called the L, into Forest Hills and stuff. You could take the train into Boston. You could take the trolley this way into Medway, all the way to Mendon, or in Medway you could switch over to Franklin and take it all the way down to Providence, Rhode Island. It's a great story. If you're familiar with Medway at all, it becomes Pleasant Street. Medway comes up the hill into Medway Center. There's a hill there. Well, the trolley couldn't make the hill, so it used to make the people get out of the trolley. The trolley, you have to walk up the hill and get back in the trolley, and they would continue the tour. So come on over this way. This here is called Ord's Block. Again, the 1890s, building blocks was kind of the big thing. And the original Ord's Block was built in 1882. Unfortunately, it burnt down in 1891 and was rebuilt. That's the original building from 1892 when that was rebuilt. And for many years on 39, Will's Hardware, which is now down on West Street, occupied most of that building. And then McCready's have purchased that and then turned it into today, which is the Avenue. The building, if you look at number 38, always faced this way, faced Town Hall. Until the late 1940s, the Norfolk County Bank came in and they took over the front part and they made a new entrance so that it now faced Main Street. But this was always the front of the building. Now it looks like it's the side of that. This was called the Town Mansion. It was built in 1816 by David Fairbanks, the same guy that had moved the store. And then next door, this house that's over here, the Ewan's house, actually this back part that you see over here would be one of the oldest in Medfield. It actually predates the King Philip War. The rest of the part was added on. Originally, this Charles Onion opened a store that was here. It was a low, one-level store. And then we talked about this Thomas Barney, ended up buying him. And you can see he added on a more substantial store that was located here. It sold everything. It had groceries, but it also had clothing, you name it. They used to be able to buy that. And number 43 is a great picture in 1900 of the bicycle race that was here in town. But you can see the wooden building in the background. That's what's here now. And in 1942, Ray Lord came to Medfield and he opened up what was called Lord's 5 and 10 cent store, which was down where Philip de Palma's is located. And in 45, he moved into the wooden building that you see that was there in photo 43. And that became Lord's, and they did a great mural to show what it looked like. You can see the old building in the background, and they added this front part. Now the post office building is still there. That's the green part of the building that's over. We'll see that in a second. And in 1957, Billy Kelly, who was partner with Ray Lord, and took ownership himself, tore down the wooden building and built this brick cinder block building that you see. So this has been here since 1957. And Lord's was here right up until 2013. And if you were living in Medfield before 2013, you would know Lord's. You could buy everything. It was always open that was here. And then Roach Brothers has taken over since then, which I think has done a pretty good job. And if you look back, you can see where Zulo Gallery is. That was we talked about the store that Thomas Barney moved. And you can see what it looked like in '45 before they added the front part with the stores. And that was used by it was called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. They were the veterans of the Civil War, kind of like today's American Legion. And they used that as their hall. Actually, for a little bit, when 1883 to 1888, when the schools got overcrowded, on the lower level, actually the first grade elementary kids actually had their schooling in there. And right here was St. Edward's Church, which was built in 1893, right where the gazebo is. By the 1960s, Medfield's Catholic population got very, very large. In fact, they were having 11 masses said on upper and lower levels on Saturdays and Sundays. And the church needed to move to a new location, and they bought the land down onto Spring Street, and the town of Medfield bought the church. And if you look at number 47, right next door was the rectory. Originally, if you look at 46, the rectory was that wooden building you see right next to the church in 46, and that was moved down to Green Street, right across from the swim pond there, where it still is located today. That was the original St. Edward's Rectory. And then they built the new brick rectory, which you see in number 47, in 1923. And then when the town bought it, they expanded the library into the rectory. So the rectory and the library became all library expansion. That's why the town bought the church and the rectory. So they had to figure what to do with the church. So they did all kinds of studies to reuse the church. There was a lot of controversy with this. And eventually they made the decision to tear it down. And the church was torn down in the gazebo, but the church stood right here. The library actually is a gift to the town by Granville Daily. In 1917, Granville Daily joins with Edwin Mitchell with the hat factory. They do the sale. He does a lot of the sales of the hat factory down in New York, while Mitchell runs the factory up here. But he has a house up here in Medfield, and his wife and daughter died, and he's very much tied into the town. Medfield's library was one of the rooms in Town Hall, which was very small, and he donates this building to the town, and he gets William Perry, who lived here in Medfield, was a great architect, nationally known. In fact, he was hired by J.D. Rockefeller to do all the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg. That's why this is in the Colonial Williamsburg style of the library that was there. And you can see that on number 48. Number 49 in the back was a sundial that was there up until the 1980s. It came down in kind of a severe storm, which was kind of a neat little sundial that was there. You see, which is now the Historical Society building, that originally was built as the Medfield Cooperative Bank. So it was the bank building that was put there. And Medfield Cooperative Bank then sold to the Needham Cooperative Bank. And in 1968, the Needham Cooperative Bank needed a larger space. And so they bought the house we're going to go to in a second down the street, and they built the bank building that's there now. And this became vacant. And the town tried to enlarge the library, and there was a house in between. It's called the Bravo House, thank you. The Bravo House that was in the middle. So the town bought the Bravo House and the bank, and they moved the house down to Park Street where it is now. But then town meeting defeated the money to extend the library. And so now you had a vacant lot and a vacant bank. And so they made a deal with the Historical Society, which had a room in the back of the library. They said, we'll give you the bank building, let us extend the library into the back of the Historical Society. And so that's how the Historical Society got the bank building. It's actually a town building. The Historical Society pays $1 a year in rent and uses the building. And then eventually, in 1996, they added the beautiful addition. They tore down what was the rectory, and they added that addition that was in there. Okay, and if you look further down the street, which we're not going to walk down, is the Episcopal Church that was there, originally built in 1905. And across the street, there's actually a plaque there, was the original Ralph Wheelock School that was located. I think in your school they have the desk. When you walk into your school, is that desk one of the, I think it's in there, right in the lobby that's there. And that burnt down in 1940. It is? Good. And so where we are right now, I paid you well. If you look at number 55, what stood here was a beautiful mansion. It was called the Moses Bullen Harding House. It's a great story. It was just a house. Notice the little L that juts out. Well, they were going to widen Pleasant Street, and they didn't like, the owner didn't like the thought he was going to lose some land. So very cleverly, he built an L out right to the edge of the street. So that's why Pleasant Street is so narrow today. It couldn't be widened because of the L. Well, when the bank, the Norfolk County Bank, we told you was where Avenue is now, they needed a larger bank. And so the house that was here, Bob Larkin owned. And that's the same Larkins from the liquor store. Well, the bank bought where Park Street Books is now. You've been to Park Street Books? They bought that building. That was going to be the bank. So they made a deal with Bob Larkin. They said, look, we'll switch. We'll take your property here. You can take our property. And that became Bob Larkin's house. He moved in there. And then the bank was going to build a new building here. And so what they did is they moved the Moses Bishop Harding House, the main part of the house, you can see it in number 56, they moved down to Park Street where it is now. And then the L, they moved down to Pound Street where it is now, right at the head of Pound Street. It sits back. And the chimneys, when you move a house, you can't take the chimneys, you have to take them down. The chimneys are now a patio and a guy's cookout on South Street. So this house is like all over town. But at least they saved it. And then Norfolk County Trust built this, and then it went to Bank of Boston, Bank of America, and now it's Bank of America. This parking lot used to be the Amoco American gas station from the late 50s into the late 60s. And if you look across the street, people either love or hate this building, known as Monk's Block. But originally it was the Thayer House. And you can see in number 59 a picture of the Thayer House. And that's the original location where Ralph Wheelock was born, right there. Not born, where he lived. Actually, he was born in England, then came to Dedham. Now, the reason the Wheelock School is named after Ralph Wheelock is because he was the first school teacher here in Medfield, but he lived in Dedham before they came to Medfield. Medfield used to be part of Dedham. And he was the first school teacher in Dedham in the first public school in America. The first school paid for by people's taxes. And he was the first school teacher and the first school teacher in Medfield. He was also on the first Board of Selectmen, the first representative. He got the first house lot in Medfield. And these early towns were all laid out with a cross. So a north-south road crossed an east-west road in the middle. And the houses were all on the north side, weather reasons, and this was all their fields that went this way. And Wheelock's property went all the way down to Oak Street, this way. Well, Pleasant Street wasn't there then. And originally South Street was going to be laid so Medfield would have a perfect east-west, north-south road. Well, Whitlock said, wait a minute, you're not putting a street into my property, and it shows you the power he had. They moved South Street down to where it is now, on the other side of Roach Brothers. So that's why Medfield doesn't have that perfect north, south, east, west. We got a kind of little dog leg for South Street. Years later, they added Pleasant Street, long after Whitlock was dead. And then you can see in 1888, they built this block. And it was this John A.S. Monks. He was a fairly well-known artist, and he was an etcher of sheep. And he did a number of different drawings, including, we won't go, but in front of this traffic box, have you ever seen the picture of Jack the dog that's in the front? They did a beautiful drawing of it. Well, he did that painting of Jack the dog, which we're going to talk about in a second. And he also did the Medfield Town Seal. That's done by Monks. And if you buy Tilden's History of Medfield, he also did all the etchings in Tilden's history. He marries the Thayer daughter, and they build this block in front of the Thayer house, which actually stayed there, was in the back. You could actually walk the second floor into the old Thayer house. And the top was a huge hall that's still there. And these double doors lead to a grand staircase that go up to the hall. Unfortunately today, because of zoning, parking, and fire regulations, you can't use that hall. But it's beautiful, it has chandeliers, it's a massive hall. The guy that owns the pizza place owns that, he stores stuff up there, but it's just kind of wasted space that's up there. Okay, right here is the United Church of Christ, and if you look at number 62, it was the original Orthodox church. We talked about that. They split from the first parish church, and by 1832, they built their church here. Unfortunately, in 1876, it burns to the ground, and they rebuild this back part. So if you look at the back part, that was the church that you see in photo 63. And it had a tall steeple. And then in 1959, they renovated the building, took the steeple down, added this front part here that was onto it. And next to it, where the main part of the church is today, if you look at number 63 and 64, is where the parsonage was located. And the parsonage remained there until the 1980s, when they added this new section on, and they moved the parsonage over to Brook Street, where it is today. And then if you look across the street where the Middlesex Savings Bank is, and if you turn the page and look at photo 65, that steep part of the building, that's the original John A.S. Monk's art studio. And it sat a little further back on the lot. And they moved it forward, and that became the Jenny State gas station, which later became a Citgo gas station that was there. And then when the Middlesex Bank bought it, they renovated the gas station. They added the two wings on each end that you see there. In fact, the one on the right, you can still see on that photo 65, was the old gas station. So they did a nice job renovating that photo 65. If you look at where Butterfly Tree Shop is there, that house dates to 1725. There's a lot of history to it. But this Dr. Mitchell buys the house. And he's the town doctor in the late 1800s, right up until 1930. And he has the dog Jack that pictures on the traffic signal that's up there. And the dog was his companion, went everywhere that he did. And there's a great story that he's called out to go to somebody's house, and it's a terrible storm. We've had rain for several days, and he's down by the Charles River. The dog is with him, it's just the two of them. And it's all dirt roads back then. And the carriage slips off the edge, and he goes into the Charles River. and he goes under the water, and he's thinking he's dead, and he looks up, and there's the dog Jack right next to him. He's able to grab onto the dog. Next thing he knows, eventually the dog gets him to shore. He grabs onto a tree branch, or he gets out. So he considers the dog has saved his life. He puts into his will that when he's buried, he wants the dog to be buried next to him. And if you go up to Temple, Maine, where they're buried, there is Dr. Mitchell's grave, and right next to it is Jack the dog, with a great little inscription on Jack's tombstone that says, "Jack, a faithful friend and companion of Dr. Arthur Mitchell, in sunshine and in storm alike, he was always on guard." Dr. Mitchell's house gets sold to the Clifton family that puts in that house Cape Cod kitchens. And they make jams and jellies. And the beach plum jelly that he makes is sold throughout the world. He is the largest maker of beach plum jelly in the world that makes there. And in the back where that kind of ugly 503 building is next to it was a barn. And he did a lot of the work that was in that. And when he got into a big lawsuit with Ocean Spray, a legal fight. He actually won the court case. He got a $500,000 settlement. But he left the jelly and jam business, and he opened up a Renault foreign car business out of the barn there. But it didn't last long because he didn't do any service work there. And so he sold, and the house became a laundry that was in there. It was called Snow White Coin Laundry. And in 1970, the laundry burnt down. And that building, Mr. Gross is his name, it's kind of a gross building, built that building that's in there now. And Tom Mitchell, who owns Mitchell Construction, you can see right there, bought and is the owner of the house. Jacob Cushman bought the rights that were here, and he opened up a horse-drawn carriage making factory. There were 4 different buildings located right here and on the side in front of the pond. So that view you see in 81 and 82 is right here. And he joined in partnership in 1880 with Joseph Baker and became known as Baker Carriage Making. And that's why the name of the pond became known as Baker's Pond up until 1976, when town meeting votes officially be called Meeting House Pond. But they had 15 workers that worked there. They made all kinds of horse-drawn carriages. And unfortunately, by 1910, with the coming of the automobile, it put the horse-drawn carriages out of business. And these buildings sat here vacant right up until the 1930s. And there was kind of a thing in Medfield in the 30s during Halloween. Kids would go and burn down vacant buildings. Gladly, we don't have that tradition anymore. But these buildings were burnt down during that Halloween. In fact, I won't give his name, but he since has died, but a very respected town official that was here in Medfield for many, many years was one of those kids that burnt that building down. Almost every house built in the 16 or 1700s has been moved. When you moved, you took your house with you. Saved money. It was cheaper to move the house and build a whole new one. Most older houses in New England, but in Medfield, have been moved. Thank you all very, very much. Okay.